Dr. Stephen Phinney, together with Drs. Westman and Volek, was one of the originators of the modern research into the low-carbohydrate diet. His work goes back to the time of Atkins in the late 1990s, early 2000. And he has provided some of the most remarkable work on low-carbohydrate diets, particularly in athletes, but also in healthy humans. And in this lecture, he will talk about his 30 years of studying low-carbohydrate diets for athletes. And the basis for the lecture is this fantastic book, The Art and Science of Low-Carbohydrate Performance.
Thank you, Donald. It's just truly an honor to be here and be part of this amazing conference. And I want to thank Professor Noakes and Karen Thompson for the job of pulling this together and bringing so many remarkable people together. And I'll tell you, I learn as much standing outside in the lobby talking as I do listening to the speakers, and that means I'm learning a whole lot in both settings. The other thing I'll say is that I only give copies of this foolish little book I wrote to very close friends with the idea that they don't spread it around, and Donald has just created a terrible crime. And the other thing I'll say is that it seems that some of us older physicians have problems with dexterity in running the machinery, so rather than try to use their pointer, which seems to be the problem, I brought my own. Just kind of cutting to the chase here, I want to start with a quote, and you've heard it from a number of people before. And I had heard it in my first year, or in my first week in medical school from the guy who taught our biochemistry course, and I thought it was his quote, and I've used it before. And then in reading Professor Noakes' Challenging Beliefs book, I discovered that the original source, and I'm very grateful for having that proper attribution. But this guy, Sidney Burwell, back in 1936, told his students that, what we're going to teach you is what we think is the truth, but in time, half of that will be proven wrong. We just don't know which half. And I think that's still true today. Now, my thunder was to get up here and tell you that probably in half of the audience, I'm going to show you something that you absolutely know is wrong, but I think you've already been kind of inundated with the fact that maybe it is, and so I'm kind of, following along as an echo rather than the leader here. But bear with me, and I'll try to move quickly, because I know you're really not here to hear me, but you're here to see Donald's film. So again, Tim has covered this, but the current consensus among most sports physiologists is that carbohydrates are absolutely essential for sport. And that goes back a long time. It goes back to the Christensen and Hansen 1939 paper. But that was, as Gary Taubes told us 2 days ago, anything that was published in German before World War II disappeared, and that disappeared. But then it was rediscovered in the 1960s by the remarkable research by the Scandinavians. And everything they said is factually true. It's absolutely true. But there are a number, just anticipating what I'm going to try to show you, there are a number of issues with their research. And one of them is that all of the studies they did showing the benefits of a high-carb diet compared to a low-carb diet were done in studies that varied less than 14 days, and many of them were a week or less. So the assumption is if you go on a different diet, that once you've eaten it for a few days, your body is fully adapted. And that issue had never really been addressed in their research. Second point is that, and partially because they assumed that a low-carbohydrate diet is necessarily a high-protein diet, and to induce students in Scandinavia back in the 1960s to eat a low-carbohydrate diet, they said, we'll give you all the steak you can eat. And a lot of those studies involved protein contents that were as high as 300 grams a day, which represents well over 30% of the person's daily energy expenditure. We now know that dogs can tolerate a 30 to 50% of energy from protein diet very well, but humans actually don't feel well and don't function well when you get that high in protein, and I'll come back to that in a subsequent slide. And the other thing is that it turns out that low-carbohydrate diets need reasonable attention to a person's mineral status. And that's been sorely neglected in a lot of studies done with low-carb diets, because the state of nutritional ketosis changes how your body uses minerals, particularly sodium and potassium. And I'll address that in my talk tomorrow and not take time doing that today. But still, the consensus is you need carbohydrates for sport. Now, for the last 50 years, I've used riding a bicycle as kind of my form of stress relief, and I do a fair amount of it. And when I got to California in 1968 and started medical school, I was in a place where there were some great mountains with roads over them, and it was a challenge to me to get on a bicycle and ride over them. And I learned some important lessons. This was in 68. The Scandinavian data was published starting in 62, but I wasn't reading that literature, and they didn't teach that to me in medical school. And as a result, in riding over these mountains, or trying to ride over the mountains, I kept hitting the wall time after time after time. And it took me a long time to figure out that if I ate a banana an hour or a muffin an hour, it wouldn't happen to me. And so I discovered for myself, and became a very strong advocate of carbs in sport. I knew I needed them if I wanted to do anything that involved the expenditure of more than a couple thousand calories. And so that was really my nutrition. The most important entry point for my nutrition training was learning that I needed to have carbs to avoid bonking or hitting the wall. So, and again, this may be an impolite term for some people, but in bicycling we call it bonking because that's the sound of your head when you hit the wall, and you just stop. And this occurs when the body acutely runs out of fuel to feed the brain. And typically it happens within a few hours of doing high-intensity sport, or less, without enough carbs to start with, or without supplementing carbs during. And my experience and what other people have told me is the first thing that they notice, the first warning that's coming on, is they start having food fantasies. You may be focusing on your event, and suddenly your brain cuts away to a food advertisement. And that's interesting. It's just, why does it do that? But it's a loss of attention. And that's the first thing. And the second is you start getting chills. It might be hot, you're exercising hard, you're sweating, and you have chills, and that's driven by the adrenaline of your body desperately trying to force the liver to release enough, break down enough glycogen to release enough glucose to keep the lights on. And then once it happens, there's a profound depression, and that's when you see the people sitting at the side of the road, watching the other runners or riders going by, just devastated by what's happened to them physiologically. And again, as you've seen in the previous presentation, even the leanest athlete has a lot of fat in their body. So, if you take a 7% body fat runner who weighs 70 kilograms, that person has 4.9 kilograms of fat in their body, and that's 45,000 calories. So even a runner who looks like this has vastly more vastly more fat in their body than carbohydrate. So what that tells us is that hitting the wall or bonking is not the fact that you ran out of fuel. You have run into an acute problem of inter-organ fuel exchange. Now, my colleague Jeff Volek, who really wished he was here, and he should have been here, and hopefully if you do this again, you have him rather than me, but he made this really cute slide. I love it. He says, here's a tank truck carrying petrol. We call it gasoline. So it's got thousands of liters of gasoline, but it runs on diesel. When it runs out of diesel, it's going nowhere because it can't use the big fuel tank. All it has is the little fuel tank. And so an athlete who hits the wall because they carb loaded and then ran out of fuel is like this tanker stuck on the road with the wrong kind of fuel, and it can't access the big tank. And the important point is that in mid-race, you can't switch from a high carb fueling strategy to a low carb fueling strategy. That's just, for whatever reason, the body doesn't do that acutely. So let's look at some really old pictures, some slides from old textbooks. But we know that adipose tissue contains a mix of triglycerides, and you've heard that now the essential fatty acid component is more like 20%. This is from back in the 1960s. So the primary driver for release of fatty acids is catecholamines and glucocorticoids, but insulin is the primary driver to keep them locked in there. But if you put somebody on total starvation or complete or almost complete carbohydrate restriction, and do it for a period of time, what happens is the release of fatty acids from adipose tissue is accelerated by the marked decline in insulin. Most of those fatty acids go to skeletal muscle and are burned directly for fuel. Some of them go to the liver and are used to make ketones, which are released from the liver and after a period of a few weeks of adaptation, circulate through the blood and are predominantly used by the brain. And these can represent close to 100%. And I'll explain later in a question if somebody wants to question that part, of the brain's energy needs. So these are a very effective fuel for brain use and replace glucose, where, with prolonged starvation, the only source of glucose is amino acid breakdown from protein catabolism. So what kind of numbers are we talking about here in this state of where ketones are produced because of carbohydrate restriction or total calorie restriction? And on this slide, Jeff and I have attempted to diagram the range from 0 concentration of beta-hydroxybutyrate in millimoles at the low end up to ketoacidosis in the upper end. And that's where most of us in the healthcare professions are taught about ketones, is we equate ketones to ketoacidosis in type 1 diabetics with inadequate insulin. And ketoacidosis begins at 10 millimolar. And below there, between 3 and 5 to 7 millimolar is the ketone level you have with total starvation, where you have no carbohydrate and no protein. When you add in enough protein, plus minerals and vitamins, to preserve lean body mass, that drives ketones down, but not way down, into this range between 1 and 3 millimolar. And we call this the optimum ketone zone. And starting in about 0.5 millimolar, beta-hydroxybutyrate, which is the primary ketone here in millimoles, becomes a very significant source of fuel for the brain and potentially to some degree for muscles and heart as well. So it's this 1 to 3 millimolar range that we call nutritional ketosis. And this is the range in which these are a very effective fuel for the body and enhances total body fuel flow and guarantees the brain a source of fuel separate from glucose, which means the body's dependency on glucose for fuel is markedly reduced. So how do you get into that zone? And here we show the amount of carbohydrate on the vertical axis and the amount of protein on the horizontal axis for multiple different diets. And if you can't read the small print here, the Ornish diet, which is probably the most popular, very low fat, very high carbohydrate diet, is somewhere north of 60% of energy coming from carbohydrates and quite low in protein, so centering around 10%. The standard American diet here is about 50% carbs and maybe 15% protein. The Mediterranean diet is reduced in carbs, not any more protein, which means it's higher in fat than the standard American diet. And then anything under 30% of calories provided as carbohydrate is generally regarded in the literature as a low carbohydrate diet. But the point I want to make here is not all low carbohydrate diets are ketogenic. And for instance, the paleo diet, to the extent that it's addressed academically, typically is described as being around 30% of calories is protein and at least 20% of calories is carbohydrate. And as Lauren Cordain pointedly told me, you have to have those 20% of carbs there, Steve, to feed the brain. And he's right. Because if you're up in the range of 30% of calories is protein, you're not going to be in ketosis. That's too much protein to effectively sustain nutritional ketosis. So if you go that high in protein, you've got to have the carbs. So they're absolutely right. And this diet works very well for a lot of people. But the more insulin resistant you are, the more inflamed you are, and I'll come back to that at the end of the talk, there are many benefits of being in nutritional ketosis, and that effectively confines one to somewhere between 10 and 20% of one's daily energy requirement. Now, remember, I said requirement here, not intake, because if you're restricting calories to lose weight, it'll look higher in protein because a lot of the fat calories are coming from inside. But when you look at what the body's using, what its fuel use is, if 10 to 20% of its fuel use comes from dietary protein coming from the outside, and you keep total carbs under 10%, then that is kind of this little circle. We call it an island of safety, if you will. And if you want to get from up here to down here, you cross a space where you don't get the benefits. And if you're in here, the carbohydrate intake you take in may be just enough to feed your brain, but probably can't support physical activity and supply the brain. So once you get down here and you're making ketones, then your brain's supplied, the carbs become a relatively inconsequential component of total body fuel flow. And I'll show you some data from some athletes that makes that point, I think, quite clearly. But when I get to this point in an audience of less rude or more rude people than you folks, somebody will raise their hand like this person here and say, that's fine, but nobody can stay on this diet long term. So why even try? And I hear that from so many of my academic colleagues of, yeah, it's a technical tour de force, but it's impossible for a human to live on a diet like that. And I point out that history teaches us many lessons. One of them is, at least when you put people in a place like the Canadian Arctic, where this picture was taken circa 1910, these people lived almost all the year, if not pretty much the whole year, on a diet consisting only of meat and fat. And these are the North Canadian Inuit people. The photograph actually was taken by the Arctic explorers, Wilhelm Stefansson. And he may be the first person, and definitely the first camera that they'd seen, the first European person in camera that they'd seen. And notice that pretty much everything they're carrying appears to be of animal origin, except if you look here very closely, this woman here appears to be carrying a double-barrel shotgun. I point that out because someone oftentimes points that out to me. So these people didn't have a choice because for at least 9 months a year, they lived on ice and snow, and there were not vegetable materials for them to search out. They were nomadic peoples. They went where the food was, and what they took with them was what they and their dogs could carry, and they're not going to carry around a couple hundred kilograms of fresh or dried berries with them when they go into their winter camp. So when they got to where they were going, they ate what they could spear, hunt, or shoot. And so we know that people can live on a diet low in carbohydrate, but what really had not been written down or translated for us was what was the actual composition of their diet. Because they had their choice. When you kill an animal, you can eat the tongue and the bone marrow and the kidneys and the fattier cuts of meat, or you can eat the lean stuff like we all have been trained to do and cut away the fat because fat is dangerous. We can make presumptions about what they did, but they were in an illiterate society. They did not write it down. So we don't have the Inuit food pyramid. Luckily, there were some people who lived among the Inuit who were literate. And this is a pastel drawing that was taken or was published in the diary of an interesting Arctic explorer named Frederick Swatka. He called himself doctor, but he actually was a surgeon. And back in his day, I guess he would have been called Mister. And anyway, he went into the Arctic looking for the log books of the Royal Navy expedition, the Franklin expedition, that disappeared in the Arctic in 1843 and was never seen again. Except I guess last year they finally found one of the ships on the bottom of the Arctic Ocean by sonar. And Swatka went looking for to find the logbooks to determine the fate of this expedition. In the process of that, whereas others who'd gone looking for this expedition and had failed went in carrying all their food, he said, why don't we just recruit some Inuit and have them hunt for us and feed us? And we'll just pay them with cigarettes and tea and whatever. And so he went into the Arctic in 1878, recruited 2 Inuit family. I like this because usually the white guys are talking to the Aboriginal people and telling them what to do. Here, the white guys are taking notes and the Inuit are talking. A little bit of a reverse of the message here. So these 2 families and 4 European origin guys leave the west coast of Hudson's Bay, travel 1,500 nautical miles across to King William Land, off the Canadian Arctic coast, find a bunch of cairns, find a bunch of abandoned boats, find all kinds of artifacts, find some skeletons of Royal Navy sailors who were still there in the open, did not find the logbooks, and then came back. But the remarkable thing about them is they all came back. All 4 of the Caucasians and all of the Inuit had traveled 3,000 miles through hostile country and suffered no fatalities. Which means that it's not just the genetics of these people, of the Aboriginal people, that allows them to follow this diet, because 4 people of European origin did it and managed to at least slog through. I stumbled upon this diary when I'd finished my dissertation research where we studied human adaptation to chronic ketosis. And I thought I'd made a major observation. And when I was reading this guy's diary, I was quite profoundly humbled because he quoted here, and this defines a concept that we've coined keto adaptation. And he said, when first thrown wholly upon a diet of reindeer meat, it seems inadequate to properly nourish the system. He says, but this soon fades away in the course of 2 to 3 weeks. Now, I'm writing my dissertation where that's my primary observation, and this guy scooped me by 100 years. But I put it in the discussion and said, yeah, but I did some stable isotope studies and did some muscle biopsies, so my data is original too. Unfortunately, Swatka did not write down precisely what the Inuit ate. So we don't know the proportions of fat and protein in their diet. So the other Arctic explorer that Tim mentioned is this guy, Stefansson, who, again, you got to wonder why these people did this. His parents were Icelandic. He was born in Canada. He moved to North Dakota as a boy, went to the University of Iowa, and then went to Harvard University to work on, basically, it was the study of Aboriginal religion, but it was basically anthropology. And he was fascinated by the Inuit, so to pursue his research, he went up into the Arctic, and he spent the better part of 10 years over a 12-year period, not just living in the Arctic, but living away from the European settlements, living among the Inuit, and learned to live their lifestyle. And there was 1-2 year period where he had no contact with the outside world, and his obituary was published in the New York Times. And then he came walking back into a coastal settlement and say, hey, guess where I've been? I found islands no one's ever seen before. So he spent up to 2 years at a time without resupply, living off the land, and remained healthy the whole time. And so when he came back to the southern 48 states in 1917, I believe it was, he started writing about this both in the academic literature and in the lay literature, and he wrote books about this. And again, you saw the names of some of his books. One of his books was entitled The Friendly Arctic, which kind of got into people's faces and so on. And he was adamant that he could do this diet and stay healthy. And in the time from 1914 until 1927, the 12 vitamins were discovered, many of which were found only in vegetable sources like vitamin C. And so he was called a liar. He was told, you can't possibly have done that because you couldn't get enough vitamins if you didn't eat vegetables. And so he was, intensely insulted and called out in the professional as well as the lay press. And as a result, he allowed himself to be locked up in a hospital in New York, which was where they locked up insane people. But it was a place where they locked up people for a long period of time and fed them. So he went in there as a research subject, and he wanted to prove he could stay healthy. And the people who were running the study wanted to prove that he would get sick. So this is a research study trying to make somebody sick. And what they expected he would develop would be scurvy, vitamin C deficiency, with less than 4 months, which is the typical time course for that to occur. He survived the whole year in perfect health. And when they wrote the paper and published it in 1930, they started the paper by saying the Stefansson experiment failed. He remained healthy. Go figure. And the neat thing is that he was allowed to eat anything he wanted to eat as long as it consisted of meat and fat. He couldn't have anything of plant origin at all. And they kept very careful records of what he ate. And this is really astounding because if you look at this, he ate about 115 grams of protein a day. By the way, he was about my height and weighed somewhat less than I do, 70 kilograms. And that represented that 115 grams of protein was about 15% of his daily energy intake. He ate over 200 grams of fat per day, and the only carbohydrate in his diet was that which was included in the meat that he ate as glycogen. So when the animal was slaughtered, there would be some carbohydrate inherent in that meat, but there were otherwise no vegetable matter and no visible carbohydrates in his diet whatsoever. And this diet was sustained for a year, and it consisted of meat, fish, poultry, of whatever he wanted. Oftentimes it was boiled because that's how the Inuit cooked much of their food. They either ate it frozen raw or they ate it boiled. And when the Inuit ate the boiled food, they drank the broth. And that was a key part of their culture, was not just meat or blubber, but broth. He also ate internal organs such as brains, kidneys, liver, and he treasured bone marrow. He loved bone marrow. And that was part of the, when the Inuit were ashore and killed caribou, the long bones of the caribou were a treasured source of food for them in terms of eating the marrow. So we have this evidence of what Stefansson chose to eat, and I would claim that if he was trying to save his reputation, he was going to do the best he could do to recreate what he had learned to eat from this culture that had survived in the Arctic. And the modern Inuit, we think, have been there for about 1,500 years. And before them, the Dorset people had been there since the last ice age. So a long period of time where people empirically figured out what to eat and what combination of things to eat. And so I would say that if I was looking for evidence for what the ideal hunter's diet would be, this might be a good objective place to start. So you have this background that people can do this, but my impression from my own experience of physical activity and diet was I needed carbs. And I assumed that that was still the case. And I got into a bit of a dialogue with one of my mentors when I was at the University of Vermont. He was my teacher at the time, and we had this argument, and he became my mentor. And we did a study where we took a group of 6 overweight adults who consented to be locked up in the metabolic research ward. So we essentially put them in a diet prison for a 7-week period. The first week, we had them on a typical balanced, quote, balanced diet, high in carbohydrates. And then for 6 weeks after that, we put them onto a ketogenic diet that was not an Inuit diet. It was a very low-calorie ketogenic diet. So it was roughly about 600 calories per day as lean meat, fish, or poultry. A vitamin pill. I think we gave them about 4 ounces of uncooked green vegetables per day, so they had a little bit of crunch in their diet. And then we gave them adequate minerals and vitamins. And again, I'll talk about that a bit tomorrow. And then we had assessed their endurance performance. We did it once at baseline, once a week after they started the low-carb diet to recreate the time frame in which the Swedes had done their studies. And then we had them continue for a total of 6 weeks on the low-carb diet and did a final test. During this time, they were untrained people, and they did not train during the experiment. So the only exercise they got were the exercise tests that we did at these 3 intervals over time. And the other problem we had, this is a weight loss diet. This is how we got them to let themselves be locked up for 7 weeks, was we guarantee them they were going to lose a lot of weight on this diet. And they couldn't be non-adherent. I hate the word cheating. They couldn't be non-adherent because we had them under 24/7 observation. But because they lost so much weight, it wouldn't be fair to do a treadmill test with them light of foot and weighing a lot less, so we put a backpack on them that contained all the weight they'd lost. So we'd put this backpack on them, we'd put them on a scale, and we'd take IV bags of fluid, textbooks of internal medicine, pathology, remember those? And the average person lost, I think it was 26 pounds. So they're carrying this 26-pound pack, and they said, oh, I got to carry this on the treadmill? Darn. So what happened? Well, cutting to the essential data, this is the time to exhaustion. And we said, just go as far as you can. And we put music, or we put movies on a screen in front of them, let them watch television, whatever, and keep them occupied as best we could so it didn't get depressed with the fact that they're walking on a treadmill. And they went a little under 3 hours at baseline. After 1 week, exactly as the Scandinavians had seen, they dropped to 2 hours. So there was a very significant and uniform among all the subjects reduction in endurance time till they said they were exhausted. And then 5 weeks after that, we put the backpack on and put them on the treadmill, and to our consternation, my consternation, they went over 4 hours. And that was really upset us because we did this in 1977. We published it in 1980, but in the early 1970s, this guy named Bob Atkins published his Atkins diet book saying that this was a super energy diet and you could lose a lot of weight and be energetic. And we looked at this and said, oh, heck, we've proved Atkins right. But we published it in the Journal of Clinical Investigation in 1980, so that was actually the first observation. But again, these are untrained people. They really didn't know what exhaustion was. And maybe they became more tolerant of just doing 3 exercise tests in a 6-week period of time. The other thing is that when we looked at their heart rate during exercise, even though they're walking at the same angle and speed in the treadmill when we're carrying the backpack, their heart rate during exercise dropped about 10 beats per minute here compared to here, which means they were more efficient carrying the weight on the back than they were around their middle and their hips and thighs. So this really wasn't a true test because these are people who didn't know what exhaustion was and their weight changed. So, wanting to really get to this matter, I decided to do a study, find a place where I could do a study where we had people who didn't change their weight and knew what exhaustion was. And so we recruited a group of lean, healthy male bike racers and locked them up in a metabolic ward at MIT in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and working with Dr. Bill Evans, who was at Boston University at the time, in a great collaborative relationship. We brought them over to BU and put them on the ergometer. You can see bandages here, so we were infusing stable isotope. It's much of what you've just seen. My data is just a lot older and not as accurate, but we had muscle biopsies and fuel use and things like that. We did indirect calorimetry to measure how much fat and how much carbohydrate they were burning during exercise. And for the diet that we put them on, we basically tried to recreate the Stefansson diet. So it was about 15% protein, over 80% fat, and the only carbs, again, came from glycogen. We gave them no plant matter of any kind. We did give them a vitamin pill and minerals as necessary. And so in this study, there were just 2 tests, one at baseline, one after 4 weeks of adaptation. The 4-week time period was determined by the practicality of money and availability of beds in the metabolic ward. I would have liked to have done it longer, but that's about the best we can do. And in our other study in Vermont, the subjects told us that after 3 weeks, for 4 weeks, they were feeling quite a bit better, that they were through that lag period of their performance. So it was a 4-week study of keto adaptation. And what we found was that VO2 max, which is the measure of peak oxygen consumption, was 5.1 liters at baseline. By the way, that's a really big number. And it was 5.0 after 4 weeks of being on the ketogenic diet. And the difference between 5.0 and 5.1 is not statistically significant. Statistically, they're the same number. So no change in peak aerobic power. Their endurance time to exhaustion at 65% of VO2 max was 147 minutes before adaptation and 151 after, again, statistically identical numbers. So we didn't change peak aerobic power, and we did not change endurance time to exhaustion. And by the way, these guys do know what exhaustion is, but realize they're doing it on a stationary bicycle. It was in a basement room with no windows, cranking away. And we're sitting around there, and it went on for 2.5 hours, and so we're eating snacks and stuff. And we weren't really doing a good job of taking care of their heads. And that's a message that I hear, and it may result in, or give an explanation for the variability of the results that Tim showed you. But what changed dramatically was this measurement called respiratory quotient. RQ, which is the ratio of CO2 production to O2 consumption, tells you how much fat versus how much carbohydrate the person is using during exercise. If you're theoretically burning pure carbohydrate, the RQ would be 1.0. If you were burning pure fat, it's 0.7. So these people at 0.83, now this is after an overnight fast, and they ate nothing during the ride, which is tough for bicyclists to do. An RQ of 0.73 represents about a 50-50 mixture of carbohydrate and fat. After 4 weeks of keto adaptation, the RQ dropped to 0.72. That's just this far above 0.70. And what that represents is over 90% of their calories coming from fat at the same power output and with the same level at the same percentage of VO2 max. So this is a remarkable change in fuel use where they move to a very high proportion of their calories coming from fat. And when we looked at the muscle biopsies, this is the pre-exercise ride at baseline, this is the post-exercise, so they used 87 millimoles per kilogram of glycogen. So the glycogen use that disappeared was 87. Over here is 23. So we reduced, at the same power output and duration, we reduced glycogen use by more than threefold, almost fourfold. So we published this data in the literature, and I, being a naive young person, I'm a naive older person, I assumed that people would look at this and say, wow, that's interesting. Now, Professor Noakes on occasion has complimented me for being willing to take it on the chin and, get beaten up by, I didn't get beaten up. I stayed in academia for another almost 20 years. I made it to full professor, but I never got to study this because I could never get money to study this. It just sort of disappeared off the radar. And then I met this remarkable guy, Jeff Volek, who's 20 years younger than I am and 20 times smarter than I am. And he took my data, which had been sitting in that paper in that sterile form you saw, and he said, Steve, you need to look at this from the perspective of the current published literature. So he took a paper that came out of Eukengroup's group in the Netherlands, where the first author in this paper was a young woman named Dr. Venables. And they published this paper in 2005 in which they collected peak fat oxidation rates on untrained and trained people with a total N of 300. So 300 people, they did graded exercise tests, and a different power output looks at how much fat they could burn, and came to the conclusion that the highest fat oxidation rate they could find in anyone out of these 300 people was 60 grams per hour, which is 1 gram per minute. Okay? Now remember the holy grail that we heard for doing the marathon at the end of an Ironman is 1.2 grams of fat per minute, and the highest they could find in anybody was 1.0. The average for the whole group together, all 300, was 27 or 28. And this is quoted as the definitive information on how much fat humans can burn during exercise. And so Jeff then took the data from my thesis project of 5 people. The lowest one was 74, the highest was 112, and the mean was 90. And he said, we got to look at this. It looks like all 5 of these people, who were normal mortal human beings, highly trained athletes, but they broke this rule big time. So with that perspective, and with Jeff allowing me to kind of be they kind of refer to me, I guess, as Yoda. I sit and watch them do the work, tell them anyway. This kind of had got out, and we started looking at this. We attended the Western States 100. It's called the Western States Endurance Run where I live in California. And this is a little event where about 400 people get together and start in the Sierra Mountains at Lake Tahoe and run up over the mountains and down the far side, 100 miles, not on roads, but on mountain trails. This typically... race typically when people run on a high carb diets, not only do they carb load, but they have to consume at least 6,000 calories of carbohydrate during the race to get to the finish line. That turns out to be very onerous for many runners, and many of the runners who try to do this have gastrointestinal problems, both upper GI or lower GI. I won't get into details, but many people either drop out or finish very slowly at the end because they can't get the carbs and keep the carbs down in order to properly fuel themselves for this race. So before 2012, this was the finish at 2012, but before this, a few pioneering runners, not people who were candidates to win the race, had begun experimenting with the low-carb fueling strategy. And these are people like Bruce LaBelle, Peter Defty, and John, must be ketones affecting my brain, John Rutherford. In the previous year, John Rutherford finished this race in 18 hours and 30 minutes on a low-carb fueling strategy. But this gentleman, Tim Olson, the previous year had finished about 20th in the race, and he said, I would have won the race if I hadn't spent so much time in the bushes in the last half of the race. So he switched to low-carb. He not only finished the race, but if you probably can't read the numbers, it says 14:46. He did 100 miles over the mountains in 14 hours and 46 minutes. And this is the first time, you see there's some light on him here? That's sunlight. This is the first time anyone finished this race in daylight. It's always held the last week in June. He cut 21 minutes off the all-time course record, finishing this race. And he reports that he did it on about 1,400 in-race calories of carbohydrate. So he was able to do it on 1/4 of the carbohydrate fuel with absolutely no GI distress. And people said, that's a fluke. And Tim came back the next year and won it again. In addition, in 2013, the third place runner was a 42-year-old U.S. Army Sergeant Major. He'd won it 15 years before, and then he said, my day job got in the way of my running. But he came back at 42, and he finished third and took 6 minutes off the Masters course record. His name is Mike Morton. So the low-carb fueling strategy, the optimization of fat oxidation as one's primary fuel, and because they're in and maintain nutritional ketosis, they maintain mental clarity through extremes of fuel flow and extremes of fuel use. This really has begun to really affect the ultramarathon community. And as you heard from Professor Noakes, Paul and Newby Fraser, beat us to this observation, but kept pretty quiet about it over 30 years ago. So what's happening with this? Are there others who are doing this? Well, this is a guy named Zach Bitter. He's a high school teacher in Michigan, so he has a full-time day job. And he set the 100-mile record at 11 hours and 47 minutes. And by the way, he did this running on a track, 100 miles, which is, we use a quarter-mile track, so it was 400 laps around this track. And beat the American record on a low-carb fueling strategy. The guy in the middle is this guy, Mike Morton, who placed third in the Western States in 2013. And this last year, he set the American 24-hour record. He ran 172.5 miles in 24 hours, again, using a low-carb fueling strategy. And the third one here will be the subject of the film. This is Sami Inkinen and Meredith Loring. And I don't want to steal your thunder, Donald, but they actually finished actually, it's a little over, it was more like 2,850 miles of ocean open rowing in 45 days. And they did it with a low-carb fueling strategy. And you'll see that in the film. So I just want to show you a bit more data and then get out of your way here. Jeff, because we saw these really remarkable results in the runners, he recruited a bunch of them to come to his lab this last year. That was when he was still at the University of Connecticut in New England in the United States. So he recruited 10 runners, ultra runners, highly trained ultra runners, who still follow a high carb fueling strategy, and then he picked 10 who follow a low carb fueling strategy for at least 6 months, and he brought them in and did a VO2 max test, did an endurance run on a treadmill. He did muscle biopsies to look at what's happening to muscle glycogen. I don't know if this is clear enough to see, but the 10 high-carb runners had an age of 33 years, their height of 173.4, body mass, i.e. weight of about 66 kilos. Over here it's 34, 175, 68. These are almost perfectly matched for height, weight, body composition, and peak aerobic power, which was 64 mils per kilo for both of them. So this is a very nicely matched group in terms of physical and performance characteristics, but where they differed was the low-carb runners ate 70% of their calories from fat, 20% from protein, and less than about 10% from carbs, whereas the high-carb runners reversed that. That was, again, close to 70% of calories is carb, 30% from fat, and 15% from protein. So this is a very high-fat diet. This is a very high-carb diet. And when they put them on the treadmill and looked at peak fat oxidation, the peak fat oxidation for the high-carb runners was 0.67 grams per minute, and for the low-carb runners was 1.54 grams of fat per minute. And notice there's no overlap between these two populations. When you're keto adapted, you're in a completely different fuel flow realm. You've switched from your little gasoline tank to your very big diesel tank, or vice versa. You've got this big fuel supply that you're tapped into. And if you look at the fuel use during exercise, the high carb runners, and this was pretty much after an overnight fast, they gave them a little shake for breakfast that represented about 150 calories a few hours before this treadmill run, but they weren't fed, essentially. And they started at about over 50% carb, cut down to 40%. This is a 3-hour treadmill run at, I believe it's 65% of VO2 max. But they never got this down below 40% in terms of the use of carbs. Look at the high-fat runners. They start out pretty much at 90% of calories as fat and don't change. These people are tapped into a fuel supply in a completely different way. And the point is, if you get to exhaustion here and run out of carbs, you can't switch to this. This takes at least 4 weeks. And what these athletes tell us, it's not 4 weeks. Yeah, they can get out and start training after a couple weeks of starting the diet. They can start training hard after 4 to 6 weeks, but they really don't feel like they have the full adaptation. And this is empiric observation, but it takes about 3 months and maybe as much as 6 months. And part of that is figuring out what to eat, because they have to completely change how they structure their diet. And they have to figure out how not to eat too much protein and how to eat a whole lot of fat. And that means different recipes, different tastes, and it's a lifestyle. It's not just something that, you open a can and it's a different diet. But the amount of the dramatic change in this process occurs somewhere in the 6 weeks to 3 to 6 month time frame, and we still need to explore that. The one last piece of data I want to show you, which I think is really probably very dramatic, and it's probably going to change, well, definitely change the textbooks, is this graph shows from low intensity, low percentage of VO2 max to up to 90% of VO2 max, shows the rate of fat oxidation in grams per minute for high carb runners and for low carb runners. Now, you may look at this and say, wait a minute, this doesn't get up to 1.5, and that's because the only slide I have is incomplete data. We haven't done all the calculations for all 10 of the runners. I think this is 7 and 7. But in the textbooks, it will tell you that your fat oxidation peaks when you get to 50% of VO2 max. And even though you're burning more calories, not just the percent, but the absolute amount of calories burned as fat drops off, starting at 50%. And by the time you get to 80%, you're burning essentially no fat. Everything has to come from carbs. And then look at the curve for the low-carb runners. It peaks at 70%, and it still hasn't shouldered until even out to 80%. That at 80% of max, this is race pace for most sports. They're running almost totally, let's say 80%, 70 to 80% of the calories is coming from fat, where at this point in time, the unadapted runners cannot use fat for fuel. This is not a subtle difference. You do not need a statistician to tell you this is significant. And this is being translated, I'm hearing from people all through this room, this is being translated into many different sports venues. I want to share with you one quote from one of the high-carb runners, whoops, got a point here, one of the high-carb runners who, when they were doing the study in Jeff's lab, they said, they would hear about this low-carb diet, and some of the runners were doing very well on low-carb. And this guy went home and said, So he sent Jeff this quote. He says, I made the switch to a high-fat, low-carb diet near the end of July. It's changed my life. Just like you said, in the first few weeks, it was extremely difficult. But now I'm reaping the benefits. Not only has my body composition improved, but performance has significantly increased. I won a trail 100K, 100 kilometer trail run a few weeks ago and broke the course record by over an hour. And he says, the time it takes me to recover is unbelievable. Parentheses, I went for a run the day after the 100K and felt fine. When people run over 50 miles at race pace, they usually take at least a couple weeks off. For the Western states run 100, many of the runners take a month off from training before they get back to training because they have so much muscle damage. They run creatine kinase levels, which is enzyme that's supposed to be in muscle, and they go up into the 30,000 levels, which are usually associated with kidney death. There's so much damage. And yet, this guy does this race, and then the next day goes out for an easy run. And we saw that with the Western states when we had people, we got samples from them, and we wanted to look at recovery, so we had them stay around. We paid for their hotel, let them eat at the hotel buffet for free. And because they get up in the morning, and these guys, these are real chow hounds after they run 100 miles, right? And so, we'd open up the room where we drew blood from them at 6 in the morning, because that's when the buffet opened up. They'd come in, get the blood draw, and then run downstairs and vacuum up the buffet. They start at the south end, go north, and don't come up for air until they see daylight at the north end. So 2 guys didn't show up on the morning of the second day. So this is 2 days after they finished the race. And we thought they'd gone to the buffet, went down and looked, they weren't there. We wanted fasting samples from them, and they didn't show up. At 10 minutes after 8, they wandered in nonchalantly. We say, where'd you guys go? You didn't go out to eat, did you? No. We went out for an easy 8 miles. And they acted like, what the hey? Anyway, so what's going on with this recovery thing? And up until 2 years ago, all of our thinking has been in fuel. brain supply, energy supply, not hitting the wall. And so adipose tissue, we know, under low insulin conditions, releases a lot of fat. It goes to the liver makes ketones. The ketones feed the brain. And also, very interestingly, it appears that the ketones feed the gut. You know, when you eat fiber and soluble fiber and make it into butyric acid, that's what your microbiome does to the soluble fiber you eat to feed your gut. Your gut likes butyrate as its primary fuel, particularly the large intestine. But it turns out that it also happens to like beta-hydroxybutyrate. Same chain length, short chain fatty acid, just one more oxygen on it, and the mitochondria in those cells can just as easily, if not better, utilize beta-hydroxybutyrate for fuel. So when you're in nutritional ketosis, it's making your gut happy, which may explain why many people with irritable bowel syndrome, when they go on low carb, it goes away promptly. Who knows? Interesting hypothesis. But the really revolutionary change that's coming is there was a paper published in Science magazine back in December by Shimazu and colleagues from Eric Verdon's laboratory at UCSF. And what they did was they took mice and infused beta-hydroxybutyrate into the mice, then gave them an oxidative stress challenge with carbon tetrachloride. They inhaled carbon tet. It causes liver damage. And when they looked at the liver, there was much less damage from oxidative stress in the animals that were infused with beta-hydroxybutyrate versus those not. And the level they infused to was 1.2 millimolar. It wasn't a megadose. It was the level that I hope, below where I am right now talking to you. And I hope it's doing the same thing for me. Of the stress of being up here trying to present this and be done in, I'll get done within 10 minutes. And what they demonstrated is this works by not a fuel effect. This works by beta-hydroxybutyrate, specifically changing the activity of genes that defend our body against oxidative stress. We have a built-in mechanism of antioxidant, highly competent antioxidant defense mechanism. And when you eat carbohydrates enough that you drive your ketones down to that very low, under 0.1 millimolar range, they're turned off. When you take away the carbs and the beta-hydroxybutyrate comes up to 1 millimolar, and even before that, your endogenous antioxidant defenses are ramped up. This is big. So systemic oxidation and stress is reduced. We know there's a recent publication that inflammatory airway disease and asthma are reduced because mast cells are the things that contain the histamine that turns on your allergic responses, that those mast cells are stabilized by beta-hydroxybutyrate. And probably the one that's gotten a lot of attention is when you take a kind of nematode worm called C. elegans, and these grow on top of a petri dish and they eat bacteria, and they're half a millimeter long. So you count them under a microscope and you watch them and see how long they live. And they only live for about 25 days. So it makes for a nice longevity experiment. And people are using this to test different strategies to improve longevity. And when you put the C. elegans in a dish with beta-hydroxybutyrate, they live 26% longer. And we hear that there's kind of a rapid movement of people studying longevity to the low-carb diet now. And they say, we don't want to wait for 2 generations to try that out in humans. It looks pretty good to us as a bet right now. And we'll see. And maybe we'll know about this sometime in the future. So my conclusions are fairly obvious, and you've probably heard them from people before me, and that is it takes at least 3 to 6 weeks of consistent low-carb diet and ketosis to fully adapt individuals, and for athletes, maybe even a few months duration. And certainly after 2 to 4 months, we're now seeing ultra-endurance athletes turning in remarkable performances and reporting they're completely free of the problem of hitting the wall. And then the other subjective observation they make is this dramatic improvement in recovery. And that's been translated by some athletes, such as Lindsey Vonn, the downhill skier, and Bodie Miller, the skier, and Marty Fish, who's was an aging American tennis player who never really did well till he went low carb, shed 40 pounds, and became America's top-ranked tennis player, which, after people like Pete Sampras, I guess that isn't really great anymore. But he, in the latter part of his career, was the peak of his career when he went low carb. So this is really becoming a tool that is coming out into the open. It's been used surreptitiously by others as well as a tool to enhance performance and particularly to enhance training. And the question that's left open is, and people ask me, it has asked me a number of times during this conference, well, how much carbohydrate should I take? How much can I take and still stay in the keto adapted state? And I have two answers to that. A, I don't know, and B, from what little I do know, it appears to be highly individual specific. And that's where, at this point, if you want to try this, you really have to do your own personal experiment and figure out how much you can get in. And we can advise you on how to test your ketones with a little finger stick meter, which is the best way to figure out how you're responding to the diet. And with that, I'll show you one of my favorite places in California, which is top of our local volcano. And I've started doing this on low carb, and I actually climb faster on low carb than I used to on high carb, just because I'm getting younger, because I'm in on a ketogenic diet. And thanks very much for your attention.